evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the final event for week 2 of National Cybersecurity Awareness Month 2024. This evening, we are going to be exploring the idea of public-private partnerships, particularly as it relates to the cybersecurity of Jamaica's national critical infrastructure and critical information infrastructure. When we think about partnerships in the context of safeguarding our national critical infrastructure and national critical information infrastructure, the stakes have never been higher. Our interconnected world means that protecting these essential systems isn't just a responsibility for governments, but a shared duty that spans the gamut of industries and sectors within a country. The resilience of our national critical infrastructure and national critical information infrastructure is not only a matter of national security, but also crucial to our economic stability and public safety. From transportation to energy, from financial systems to communication networks, these infrastructure form the backbone of the modern and contemporary society that Jamaica is seeking to become as we push for digital transformation. A breach or disruption in any of them can have cascading effects, disrupting lives, economies, and even our own national sovereignty. Today, as we explore how strategic partnerships between public and private sector can create stronger defenses, more rapid response mechanisms, and innovative solutions to emerging threats, we must bear in mind the nuanced makeup of the public and private sector here. Our esteemed panelists represent a wealth of expertise from both sectors, and I'm eager to delve into their insights and how we can build more effective collaborations for a more secure future. With us today, we have Mr. Trevor Forrest from 876 Solutions. He's a founder and CEO and a distinguished IT practitioner with over 3 decades of experience, particularly recognized for his expertise in cybersecurity, digital transformation, and artificial intelligence. His career has been marked by a steadfast dedication to elevating ICT standards within both the private and public sectors, where he has been instrumental in designing and elevating a multitude of ICT projects and digital transformation strategies. From the major organized crime and From the major organized crime and anti-corruption agency, we have Wendy and Guscott, who is currently pursuing a bachelor's degree in information and communication technology at the VTDI. She's also Access Data certified as an examiner and has vast experience in law enforcement as an intelligence analyst and with training in open source targeting. Also with her, we have Mr. Dave Scott, who is a digital forensic examiner and cybersecurity specialist with a robust background in forensic chemistry and digital forensics, extensive experience in evidence collection, analysis, and cybersecurity threat management. He is certified in multiple forensic and cybersecurity tools with a continuous focus on advancing skills in threat hunting, malware analysis, and intelligence analysis. Ladies and gentlemen, our panelists will each have 5 minutes to give their opening thoughts, and then we will have some questions from my side, after which we will open it up to the floor for questions, should there be any. And we'll start with Mr. Forrest, and then Ms. Guscott and Mr. Scott.
Good evening, everyone. I hope you're hearing me. So, I mean, just to start, I'd like to thank the CERT for inviting me to participate in this discussion. It is something that is of prime interest to me, for one, because when we look at the past 5 to 10 years, cyber attacks on critical infrastructure have gone up in not only in frequency, but the level of sophistication has just skyrocketed. And when we talk about critical infrastructure, we're talking about utilities, power supply, JPS, water, NWC. We're talking about telecommunications, even health care. I can consider as a critical infrastructure, because if we think about it, if any of these services suddenly become unavailable, we just can't function. If light goes, if water goes, if Flow or Digicel has problems, and if you go to the hospital and you can't get service, these are some very critical components in our everyday functioning. And the thing about it is, because we're pushing so hard to go digital, the attack surface for these kinds of utilities now, it's extremely appealing, and it gets highly exposed. From about 2020, we started to notice some serious shifts in the kinds of attacks that were being promulgated just on a normal basis. But we also started to see globally that there were a lot of attacks on critical infrastructure, and that I normally tell many of my colleagues and even associates is that, look, it's one thing when, let's say, you get a power cut because a transformer blew. You can go outside and point on the transformer and say, yeah, there's the problem, and JPS technicians will come and they'll fix that. When you have either a state-sponsored or a threat actor attacking your critical infrastructure, it's very difficult to sit down and point at where the problem is to then go and fix it. And because of that, it will take a long time to treat with the fallout. And that time equates to money and inconvenience and, a lot of economic impact. So when we look at things like the Colonial Pipeline attack, the attacks on the wastewater systems across the United States, CDK recently, which was the platform for all the car dealerships globally, when Russia attacked the Ukraine power grid, all of these things, which we may think, you only see on TV, they're quite real. Now, because most of the critical infrastructure is privately owned, it becomes necessary for some sort of partnership to be created between the public sector and the private sector, primarily because it's vital for this partnership to exist. The threats that these infrastructure components see are shared threats. And because the public sector provides the laws, the governance, the regulation, and I guess you could say national security expertise, the private sector tends to have more of the innovative technological capacity and the ability to move quickly from a operational standpoint. Yep. So once you look at those spheres and you think about combining the strengths of each one, you find that you can have a very robust and resilient protection mechanism if you bring those two together. So I think it's very important for us to assess and look at the partnerships that need to exist, look at the models and the governance structure that needs to exist, because I know one of the biggest fears whenever you mention public-private partnerships in areas as sensitive as these, there's always a trust factor that immediately jumps in. So I think we need to seriously look at how we can treat with that. Because it is a necessity, as the theme of this discussion highlights, that this partnership exists, because each sector cannot deal with it effectively on its own. I will leave it there, and we can discuss further as we move through the discussion.
Thank you very much, Mr. Forrest, for your insights at this point. For Ms. Guscott and Mr. Scott, we're just going to go directly one after the other so that we minimize on the time that we spend cutting in. But I do note some of the key points you have raised, Mr. Forrest, and I'll come back to them once we start the question section.
Okay, good evening, everyone. It is a privilege to be here today, and I would like to thank JCERT for bringing together such an esteemed group of professionals to discuss a topic of growing importance: critical infrastructure and the necessity of public-private partnership. In today's increasingly interconnected world, critical infrastructure represents the backbone of our national security, economic, and public safety. Sectors like energy, telecommunications, transportation, finance, and water services all play a crucial role in sustaining our daily lives. However, the very systems that enable modern convenience are also becoming more vulnerable to complex and evolving threats, from cyber attack to natural disasters. These challenges demand a comprehensive response, one that leverages the strength of both public infrastructure and private enterprise. The need for a strong public-private partnership cannot be overstated. Both sectors bring unique resources and expertise to the table. Governments have the responsibility to regulate, oversee, and provide intelligence. Meanwhile, private companies often control the day-to-day operations of critical infrastructure, making them vital stakeholders in ensuring its security and resilience. Today, we will delve into the nuances of this partnership, exploring key areas such as digital asset management, risk and threat assessment, cybersecurity, and the importance of government in building a resilient infrastructure. Our goal is not only to examine how public and private sectors can collaborate more effectively, but also to highlight actionable strategies that will ensure the continued stability and protection of our critical systems. I look forward to engaging with my fellow panelists and all of you here today in what I'm sure will be an insightful and productive discussion. Together, we can shape a more secure and resilient future for our critical infrastructure. Thank you.
All right. Good afternoon, everybody. So, as my fellow panelists mentioned earlier, critical infrastructure is in great need of being protected from the different attacks that are out there, cyber attacks, physical attacks, and everything in between. Given how essential these sectors are, we face an inescapable reality. And they're vulnerable to a lot of different threats. With the natural disasters, the hurricane, the flood, the earthquakes, or the man-made disruptions. such as the cybersecurity, ransomware, the APTs, all of those. So there's a great need for the public and private entities to come together and figure out how we can properly protect these and the infrastructure together. We had the energy, JPS, water, the NWC, all of those, the telecommunications, you need to properly secure them, because just one failure in any of the key sectors that could cascade into a wider disruption that impacts the economy, the national security, and the daily life of each and every Jamaican citizen. So, and no one entity can do it alone. So there's a great need for the partnership there. JSER can't do it alone, MOCA can't do it alone, the government can't do it alone as a whole. So that's why we need the private entities to come on board and come together with us, see how we can properly secure them, the impact we can have in that, in terms of that securing. Sure, thank you.
All right, so ladies and gentlemen, the matter of critical infrastructure is one that is very nuanced to different countries, and not just individual countries, but also within regions. If we think back to about a year ago, when the challenges that were being faced with vandalism of, for example, Flow's network, where it led to the call for the vandalism of its infrastructure to be treated as a terrorist act and for it to be dealt with as such. It really is something that when you look at it, one has to wonder where the discussion began and where it is now. But Trevor, I want to throw the first question at you. And you mentioned the whole matter of trust and trust deficit. And whenever we talk about the government in Jamaica, usually that's where it starts. And when you look at it, is there really a trust deficit in all sectors of government? And if there isn't, then why is it that it is seen as one of the reasons why public-private partnerships tend not to get started, and if they get started, tend to falter after very short periods of time?
Well, that's a really good question, because we face it all the time, even now. So I think the trust issue is on both sides. So from the private sector side, a lot of times what I think you find is that certain private sector companies, they're very reluctant to share sensitive information, because sometimes the information they're sharing may amount to a competitive advantage, right? And that may apply to private sector spheres where there is competition. So that's like the telecommunications environment. And of course, when you start to go down that road, then the legal minds in these entities start to work overtime, because again, there are liability issues that they are fiercely protecting against. There are issues around reputational damage, because look, when you have partnerships like this, the information that you're sharing is about things that are happening, have happened, or could happen. And those things may cause reputational damage. So there is, and if you have to share it, that means it may get out. Now, interestingly, I think with the advent of the data protection legislation, where breaches and such things have to be reported within a period of time, I think the concerns now may be a little bit more managed or measured, because the law requires you to talk about these things now. But I think a lot of the trust issue on the private sector side came a lot from the liabilities, the reputational damage, the thought that you may lose competitive advantage and that kind of stuff. And of course, what will the general public say as it relates to confidence in the fact that some of the information you may give out may create the perception that you're running a party shop. So these are some of the concerns that the private sector sphere might have. From the public sector side, I think a similar type of situation prevails when we talk about issues of national security, because again, if it is that the capacity to help solve some of the problems resides in the private sector, and the need for that capacity would result in insights into national security issues, classified information, and so on, then you start to get a little cagey with just who you allow to gain access to this kind of information, to get to see the insides of what we speak about when we talk about national security and the different levels and layers of protection that exist there. Because there obviously some of these areas are not for public consumption. So I think from the public sector side, there's always a concern, especially in law enforcement, when you talk about sharing classified information with private companies and how well that information will be protected or how well it will stay confidential or top secret or so on. So I think that's where you start to get a lot of the apprehension. To solve these things, though, I think, if certain frameworks are put in, because it is done elsewhere in other jurisdictions, but I think we need to work on getting certain frameworks and perhaps regulations in place that once you become a part of a national security apparatus or a partnership within that, there's some things that you're just required to do, some things that you cannot do. If you consider laws like the Interception of Communications Act and what it requires of telecommunications providers in the furtherance of what law enforcement is doing, there are some things that they're required to do. So I think through the right frameworks, policies, and laws, we can overcome this issue of trust that hinders this kind of partnership from getting off the ground.
Right. So thank you for that. And it's interesting that you mentioned the whole matter of frameworks and policies as well as national security, and we'll come back to it later on. But to go a little bit deeper on the point of national security, and Mr. Scott or Ms. Guscott can really sort of answer this one. The whole matter of national security is not an all-encompassing veil. There are certain things that just can't be divulged, but there are certain things that must be shared in order to build national security as far as resilience and defense in depth are concerned. So what are the main concerns that law enforcement has in terms of securing critical infrastructure from a public-private partnership standpoint? Dave or Wendy, and you can answer.
From the private partnership standpoint, that if your national security is a valid one, because naturally there are some information that needs to be kept under wraps from the the general public or the private entities that would be partnering with us. Any sensitive information leaking out and all of that. So from that standpoint, we would need to share as much as possible with them, that without needing to hinder or not sharing anything that would hinder our backbone, as it were, the backbone of our operation and stuff like that.
Wendy, any thoughts?
All right, so let's take a look into the cybersecurity threats based on the question that you just asked. We can see that critical infrastructure is increasingly interconnected, as I mentioned in my opening remarks. And it is dependent on digital systems, making it very vulnerable to cyber attacks, such as ransomware, malware, denial of service attacks. So law enforcement must address the potential for hackers, nation-state actors, and cyber criminals to disrupt or damage vital systems like energy grids, water supply, and transportation networks.
Yeah, but you're both not really sort of addressing the point that I'm trying to get out here, because we're talking about a partnership where the public sector and the private sector have resources, they have interests in securing the infrastructure. Now, if law enforcement has insight on a particular vector of attack or a particular vulnerability that's out there, or any other public sector entity, why would there be such a difficulty in redacting, anonymizing, pseudonymizing, and sharing so that you actually raise the resilience of the private sector entities? Certainly, we can't just say we can't share because of national security and leave it at that.
Well, if I may speak to that, Godfrey, you see, the thing is, we know the methods and processes that we should use. So you mentioned sharing information redacted, which is what everybody else does. But the thing about it is, you actually have to have systems, platforms, and frameworks to do that, all right? And to do that in a secure way. And I think there is a significant gap that exists between both spheres so that the information can be shared in a way that both sides can feel comfortable that, okay, this side not getting too much information, and boy, if the information gets out, whoever else sees it is not going to, it's not going to come back and haunt us, right? So I think when I mention that we need frameworks, it's not to be underestimated, because it's a complex thing to do, because ultimately we're trying to protect all parties involved, so that the cycle will keep happening. I just think that right now we have not on either side gotten to a point where we have the tools and the platforms and systems in place to actually do it. And the reason for that is because we haven't sat down with a goal in mind to do that.
But Trevor, I really have to stop you there, because when we talk about having not sat down, certainly the government of Jamaica would have invited all stakeholders in the cyber ecosystem to broad-based consultation on our National Critical Infrastructure Protection Plan. And the persons who turned up either could not speak on behalf of their entities or were unwilling to commit on behalf of their entities. So now we're at a stage where the next step in that evolution is cabinet approval and promulgation / implementation. And I shudder to think that somebody in the ecosystem is going to stand up and say, but we weren't consulted. Now, if we really want to get ahead and to move the potential for effective public-private partnership, we have to be willing also to sit at the table to iron out the frameworks within which we're going to partner.
I suspect, and you're absolutely right, but you touched on a very important thing right there. People who came to the meetings could not speak for their organizations. What that says to me is that we were speaking to the wrong people. Now, this may not be something that, we like to admit, but, and I'm speaking now with the private sector hat on, right? A lot of times, the gravity of these kinds of discussions is not fully understood by the people who make the decisions, either because it has not been properly articulated to them, or they just have no interest, because we are very reactive and not proactive. But one of the things we have to understand is, to get the decisions we need made, we have to get the right people in the room. So whenever certain people hear things about cybersecurity and security and technology, they pass it off to a certain group of people who, as you have said, are not able to speak for or make decisions. And I think what we need to do is to ensure that this thing is escalated to the level where the right people are in the room. So that's the first thing. The second and last thing I would want to say about it has to do with the fact that sometimes the only way to motivate certain sectors is to make it law. And because it is law, you have to do it. Because if there is no threat or consequence of not taking a particular action or making a particular decision, then it's not going to happen. So I think there are a number of tools in the toolkit that can be employed. But I think we have to, really be serious about this before the proverbial, shit hits the fan. And I don't think that those who need to be involved have been sufficiently motivated to find themselves at a meeting so they can make a decision. I don't know if that makes sense.
I think it makes perfect sense as we segue into the next question, because one of the challenges that you face is that once you talk about partnership, there is the whole, there is a trust deficit that government needs to fix, or we can't share because we're involved in national security or law enforcement. But, there's a question in the chat that really sort of speaks to that. The question reads, how relevant is the concern about confidentiality in the context that the very hackers are making known to the public what their respective exploits, that they're perpetrating to attack your systems are? These are not secrets. And so short of MOCA saying, well, we use tool A to do action B, certainly if there is a threat that has been examined, analyzed in such a way that you have indicators of attack, indicators of compromise, the mantra of national security, why we're going to sit back and wait until you get attacked in order to assist you, rather than sharing those with you so you can protect yourself. That's what PPP ought to be where NCI and NCI are concerned. Certainly it's not waiting to see who gets attacked first and how quickly we can respond, when we can mitigate whether it happens or even the impact of it. But we will get back to that in a little bit. Now, Another thing in the chat, which coincides with my next question, has to do with regulation, legislation, and how that is created in Jamaica. Now, there is usually consultation to sort of get consensus or at least get a feel, the temperature of the space before you put new legislation out there. The private sector tends not to get on board until you get to the Joint Select Committee part of it. At that time, you would have already expended significant effort. Now, when we think about cybersecurity and we think about national critical infrastructure and information infrastructure, what are some of the reasons why the private sector tends not to participate at the early stage? And then at the back end, when a lot of the suggestions will take time to be worked into the mix, it seems as though government is dragging its feet. How can we fix that dichotomy as we go forward?
That's an easy one to answer. Make it about what is important. So, if I were to ask you what is the main driving force of a private sector entity, there's only one answer to that, right? It's about the money. No, they don't respond to the technical jibber jabber and so on. If something is going to affect their bottom line, they'll pay attention. So what has to be done is the compelling argument must be in a language they understand. Right? Now, if you want to get somebody interested in what you're talking about, speak their language, give them enough motivation, but stay focused on what is important to them. And what is important to private sector is the money. A lot of us, even sitting in this discussion, firstly, technical people. You lose private sector decision makers within 5 minutes of having a conversation, because if you go technical on them, they start to go off into another universe. So I think what has to be done to get them involved even before the Joint Select Committee stage and so on is a case has to be made that, look, hey, this is going to affect your money, right? And it is in your best interest as it relates to your priorities to pay attention to this. No, we have seen perfect example of this. The Data Protection Act. To date, the uptake has been okay. It's not been like in other jurisdictions. And the reason for that is ain't nobody been properly fined yet, right? But I can almost guarantee you the day the Office of the Information drops a fat fine on a company, everybody's perspective and priority on why they need to pay attention to data protection and privacy will fundamentally change. In fact, when they see it happening in other jurisdictions, they get concerned. So if we are now wanting to, and I bounce between public and private sector because I've played in both spaces. If we want to, in the public sector, get more interest from the private sector, we have to communicate to them in terms that they understand, in terms that make sense to them. And I would say that every time we start down a legislative pathway, public sector focuses on what it's good at, and that's not business, and that is not talking about the money. They're good at talking about how laws and regulations are supposed to be written and created and all those considerations. I think what we need to start to do is to kind of know, learn how to speak the language of the people who we want to get engaged. And if you do that, you may find that the involvement because of the motivation not to lose the money may come earlier.
All right. I am agreeing with what Mr. Forrest just said. The companies, talking about private sector now. Private sector companies, they may not see the immediate values in getting involved in the early stage of the legislation, in legislation, sorry, because it's there, let me see, hold on. They think that it may appear to benefit the government more, the government interests more than their own. So they would prefer to wait until the later stages when the impact of the law becomes clearer to participate more in the legislations.
Wendy, Trevor, I hear you. But that same language of money, Trevor, isn't that one of the reasons sometimes why government hold off on certain legislative pathways? Because when we think of our critical infrastructure, the conglomerates that run them, that own them, that part own them, are such that to lose that business, that presence is much more of a concern than ensuring that the service being provided is properly regulated and there are sanctions and repercussions for non-compliance, essentially.
Yeah. So you see when you use words like regulated to private sector companies, they cringe. So you have to use the right words, right? Because if these entities, because remember, everybody loses when these entities do not protect their infrastructure and their services. They lose because they have to spend money to bring their systems back online that have been attacked and damaged. The customer is impacted because they're not getting service, so they immediately blame a service provider, right? The government will also be impacted monetarily because the economy is impacted, right? So everybody loses here, right? But what I don't think we take time to quantify is, okay, how much does this kind of thing cost? So if we can't say, all right, if JPS suffered a critical infrastructure-based cyber attack today and went offline such that the entire island was without electricity, what would it cost JPS? What would it cost the government of Jamaica? And what would it cost every private sector company that is impacted by that? Regardless of whether you have a generator or not, you're going to feel it, right? What happens there and what does that cost? Those numbers need to be clearly understood, and those numbers need to be thrown in front of everybody's face. Godfrey, we can sit down and say, yeah, the average cost of a data breach is $4.5 million US. Well, you tell somebody that they don't get that, right? But what I can tell you is the last government agency that suffered a breach had to pay $36 million to fix it. Case study, right? So we need to make it about the money. If if JPS is attacked and goes offline, how much is it going to cost you, JPS? If JPS goes offline, how much is it going to cost the telecoms providers and that inconvenience? And so make it about what it's going to cost you if you don't put things in place to defend against these things, right? So once you start there, you put a dollar figure to it. When you start there, then you can start to say, well, look, based on that, as as government, protecting the interest of our stakeholders as citizens, here are the things that we are proposing to implement to fix this, to minimize the cost, not only to us, but to you, the business, the private sector. And you have to have those discussions with them at that level. And I'm gonna sound like a broken record because I'm gonna constantly be saying it's about the money, right? Because that's what it boils down to. And everybody is losing here, everybody. And once we understand that, and once everybody understands that, then we can have a sensible discussion to determine, okay, how do we minimize the losses? Because that's ultimately what this is about. It has nothing to do with the technical aspects of defending against the threats. The threats are gonna come, right? But the cost of not doing anything to mitigate those threats, that's what's important to fostering the partnership, because government going to lose, citizen going to lose, private sector company going to lose, the country going to lose.
I hear you loud and clear, Trevor. So Dave or Wendy, when we think about regulating the national critical infrastructure and critical information infrastructure space, the concerns sometimes come down to the ability of the regulators or law enforcement to actually make an impact. And when we look, for example, at utilities and the OUR, largely their regulation has been about physical and quality of service. When we start getting into the realm now of security, both from a physical and cyber-physical as well as cybersecurity standpoint, what role do you think law enforcement can play in sort of lessening that trust deficit and building confidence in the public sector's ability to partner effectively and deliver a secure national critical infrastructure for Jamaica?
All right, so pivoting off your point, Sir Godfrey and Mr. Trevor, that question go hand in hand there. So the companies don't want to think about, how they would, how they protect against the cybersecurity attack, because in their mind, it's not really going to happen to them in their leadership life cycle. You can tell them that, XYZ company has been, they've been affected by this ransomware, this breach, this malware. But unless you have to bring it into their perspective, their individual perspective as the company, the organization. And in terms of your question now, in helping to bring it across, training and public awareness is always an option, as well as, you go in there, you talk, as Mr. Forrest said, you talk their language. You put it into the monetary value terms. You can slip in some technical jargon as well to help to solidify the claim.
Wendy, any thoughts?
All right, so with what my colleague just said, law enforcement can help to bridge the trust gap between the government and the private sector in Jamaica by promoting open communication and listening to the public concerns. Basically, spread awareness. By pushing for legal protections like confidentiality agreements, they can make businesses feel safer sharing information, encouraging collaboration to better protect the critical infrastructure.
As we keep our eyes on the clock in one side of the screen, I want to open it up to the attendees here, and we'll take your questions now. If you don't have any, I have a lot more that I can actually go through. But since you took the time to join us, I will take your questions if you have them. Just raise your hand and I'll unmute you so you can ask a question. No questions?
See, Joaquin has her hand up.
Okay.
Hello, Joaquin.
Hi, Trevor. Good evening, everyone. Good evening to the panelists. So we at the top of the conversation, there was this question and discussion around confidentiality and the concerns that private sector entities have in sharing. And the question I have is, how relevant is the concern about confidentiality in the context that the very hackers and or cyber criminals are making known to the public their respective exploits? So, you know, they're out there publicizing all of this already in various fora and places and platforms. And so it really begs the question about, I think, about the private sector entities' posture, that we don't want to share because we're concerned, one, about our image and other things. So that's my question to the panel. How relevant is the concern in that context?
So the concern is relevant because, and let me address this from two sides. What attackers are sharing out a road is, one, the fact that an entity got attacked. Two, here is the information that I stole, right? So, and that happens once in a while, as in the mind of a private entity, because at the outset, their thinking is, nobody's gonna attack me, until they get attacked and until it becomes public. If it don't become public, they've never been attacked, even if they have been, right? So what the attackers are sharing is, one, that the entity has been attacked and compromised, and two, if possible, the information that has been compromised. All right. Now, the trust issue and the sharing issue comes from the standpoint that a private sector entity may say, yeah, but I haven't been attacked. And chances are, in their mind, I won't be attacked. So I'm going to keep the information that I deem confidential to my business, that I deem as a competitive edge, for as long as I haven't been attacked. Now, the thing about it is like insurance, right? For natural disasters. We have a culture now. This is the cultural part. We have a culture that says, listen, you know what? I'm not going to spend a couple $100,000 every year for an event that may not happen. Here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to deal with it when it happens. So I'm not going to insure my house. I pay for the roof when it blow off. Right? That's a cultural thing. Now, until we've gotten to a point where either they understand that, look, because this is a real, clear, present danger, it's happening a lot, then the notion that it is what I may stand to lose if I share the information is a lot less than not participating in an effort to just make sure it doesn't happen, doesn't register, right? So that's on the private sector side where the concern is legit, because they're saying, well, in their mind, at the point where they have not been compromised, they're not losing anything. So why am I going to share confidential information that may cost me a competitive edge? That I can quantify because they know those numbers. What they don't know is what it's going to cost when you get compromised. And that's why I go back to the point where we have to make the case to them in terms they understand, and that has to do with the money, right? So I can now point, because it happened, to a government agency and say, listen, you see, when, not if, when you get breached, right? It's a guy down the road that spent X amount of money as a result of that breach. That can and will be you. So you tell me if you want to spend this 10 million here to prevent that, or 30 to 40 million when it happens. You make the decision, let me know. Holla back. They understand that because that's math, right? If it doesn't happen before, them don't see it happening a lot. And that's why that concern is somewhat valid, because in their mind, the loss they could incur by sharing confidential information that's a competitive edge is far more than the sometimes false notion that I'm secure. Does that kind of make sense there? Does that answer that question? I think Joaquin is muted. Oh yeah, okay. I mean, look, as a practitioner, we face the same problem, because when we try to get companies to invest in cyber security and defense solutions, they're like, yeah, but everything's working. Nothing has happened. Why you want me to spend all of this money to protect myself against something I can't even see or touch? Why do I need to do that until it happens? So that's that's the catch-22 there. And I dare say the same thing happens in government when you try to convince government agencies that they need to invest to protect themselves against the attacks that are real.
Right. So the question I have here, since there's one more, one hand.
Roger.
Rahala,
good evening, everyone. So it's not really a question, but just piggybacking off of what Trevor said. I mean, with our culture, there is really market demand for cybersecurity, especially for the small, to medium-sized businesses. With the culture, and I think it really amounts to the individual, right? I mean, granted, you may have persons in an organization who, maybe have a certain notion, or, cybersecurity, obviously very important. However, being able to even persuade a board or so forth, in terms of procurement and stuff like that. Like I think we definitely need to, address this issue at a larger level. I mean, yes, October is, cybersecurity awareness month and so forth. However, I do think that especially what the government can do, or just try to raise more awareness for these type of things. I mean, look at GDPR in the UK and its territories. I mean, 4%. That's a lot. Of the company's annual profits. So I do think that we can adjust this at more consistently and at a more national level.
Right. So thanks for that, Roal. The point though is that cybersecurity awareness for us and for a lot of the practitioners in Jamaica is year-round. It's not just in October. And the reception is not uniform across the board. There are some companies who welcome it, they will engage you. There are others who will try to sidestep you every time you try to tell them that, look, let's have an engagement. Even things like vulnerability notification. There are companies that will accept the vulnerability notification. They will not acknowledge it. They will not respond to it. They will not fix the vulnerabilities. And when the breaches occur, then they tell you, boy, I did see it coming, but I never did anything about it. So it is really not so much about what the government can do as what each and every individual and body corporate needs to do to change the culture of the ostrich mentality with respect to cybersecurity. And we're not talking about an MSME here tonight. We're talking about the Digicels, the Flows, the JPSs, the NWCs. We're talking about those companies that either own, operate, or partner with government to deliver critical services to this country. And what we're not seeing is that sort of willingness to, one, share threat intelligence data, two, collaborate with respect to vulnerability reduction, three, collaborate with respect to sharing breach data, or four, just collaborating with finding solutions to the common problems. So my final question to the panel.
But before I ask a question, Godfrey, let me ask you a question based on what you've just said. What's their motivation?
For not participating?
No, what's their motivation to participate?
Their motivation to participate really comes from their inability, in some cases, to defend their own networks. And two, the responsibility of government to ensure that this service is kept available, irrespective of the situation, to the population itself. Now, I hear you about legislation, and the legislation is in the work. But again, when we had the consultations and we invited these entities, the people who they sent could not adequately represent their concerns or move the process along. And so, as a member of the private sector and as an individual who has served in the public sector, the dilemma you probably face is, how do you then represent this to your private sector peers that, look, it's not okay for JPS to think that their parent company outside of Jamaica is the only stakeholder in how they operate. And we really don't want to overregulate cybersecurity, the cybersecurity space. But we're getting there with the legislation. We have the National Critical Infrastructure Protection Plan. The challenge now is that we have to go resensitize both the public and private sector, because the people they sent to the 3 consultations that took place could not, in our estimation, really represent the fulsomeness of the company's situation. So the National Critical Infrastructure Protection Plan is here. The drafting notes for the legislation has been done. But in an effort to negate that we were not consulted stance that the private sector tends to take, we will have to resensitize them before we can push it out. So it causes delays.
I would suggest to you that when you peel away all the layers of the onion, their lack of motivation, again, has to do fundamentally with what it will cost them. And again, even though we may let us say that the legislation that is coming, right? Let us just say that it is clear in that legislation that there will be a cost if you are not motivated to take a certain stance or not motivated to enter into certain partnerships. It's going to raise some eyebrows. But what we have to understand is that that is the only way to get the kind of engagement that you want. So I think, and I had a particular luxury when I was working in the public sector, where we could dictate who needed to be at the meeting. I think we need to work through the layers to ensure that when such a meeting is requested, that the people who are making the requests have sufficient juice to command a particular participant, if you get what I'm saying. So because of the importance of what is being discussed, right? And once you get those people into the room, the discussion has to be along the terms and with the language that they understand, right? So when you go to those meetings with the CEOs of huge private sector organizations, the Grace Kennedys, the Mussins, the Digicels, the Flows, their language is at a particular level. You speak that when you're in the room with them because that's the only thing they're going to understand. And because of that, they will initiate certain actions. When you go to cabinet, you have to speak cabinet's language to get a response out to them, right? So I think it requires a certain amount of finessing to get the right people in the room in order to get that flow down so that the kind of partnership that is required works. Outside of that, money, laws, regulations, and if all else fails, fire and brimstone, right? You scare the hell out of them because, again, if that isn't clear that it's going to cost you something, it's going to affect your bottom line. Yeah, okay, whatever. I have more things to worry about. Right now, that's not a priority. Your thing has to be made a priority on their priority list. And the only way to do that is to make it about the money.
So after all of that, where really is the potential for viable public-private partnerships in securing Jamaica's critical infrastructure? And that's my final question to all the panelists.
Well, personally, I think we have to get a little creative with the thing, right? So I think there are some. So right now, I think the advent of the data protection legislation presents an opportunity for what we are trying to accomplish here. It presents a meaningful opportunity because that piece of legislation indirectly impacts the need to ensure that your cyber posture is where it needs to be. Now, because the law has certain requirements, I think in the context of that, certain argument, and when I say certain requirements, I mean if you're not compliant or if you get breached and you're not demonstrating certain things, you get fined. See, money, right? That's the only reason I'm paying attention to that stuff anyway, because I'm afraid of the fines, right? But I think equating the need to make sure your posture is where it needs to be to those fines and compliance is an opportunity. Second, as it relates to coming law, I think the discussions need to be, again, such that it appeals to their money senses. So perhaps an invitation, at the highest level, to the highest level of these entities we wish to partner with is important. The other thing that's also important is those, we tend to look at public-private partnerships as only existing in a particular tier, right? Big company. But I would submit to you that you have a lot of medium-sized companies that would benefit quite a bit from the kind of assistance that the capacity that government has could provide to them. And because of that, they would be more willing to partner. Now, because there are so many of them, the impact that you get may be a lot greater with 1,000 of them than 4 of the big ones, right? And what you may find is that when you have sufficient groundswell, because you're working with so many of the medium size or the small ones, then you find that the pressure gets put on the larger ones, right? So perhaps we need not only to look at the big companies to engage, but look at some of the smaller and more influential ones. Do not discount publicly traded companies. Because bear in mind, you see the digitals and the flows, they're not publicly traded enough. So there are some things they don't have to do. If you now go and look at publicly traded companies that they have to fall and function within certain constraints, look at them as well. And you have the regular stock exchange and the junior stock exchange. So target some of these entities, provide resources, because there's a resource gap, there's a cyber skills gap, there's expertise that exists within even your team, within law enforcement, that these private sector companies would welcome and benefit, over and above just law enforcement and cyber response. So programs need to be developed, in my view, to engage small and medium-sized companies and also companies on the stock exchange, because like I said, a lot of the ones that we tend to focus on are very large privately owned companies, right? So I think we also need to look at that. And finally, always frame it in terms of money. A wise man told me, a former president of Costa Rica said, listen, if you want to get your point across to a politician, make it about votes, because that's what they care about, right? Well, if you want to make your point resonate with business leaders in the private sector, make it about the money. And I think we need to get into that frame of mind where when we're having those discussions with them, we speak in terms and in language that they understand, so that we get the kind of response we need to get from them.
Wendy, Dave?
All right. So in Jamaica, the public-private partnership, it can have a strong potential in sectors such as energy, telecommunications, transportation, water management, and even cybersecurity. So collaborations between the government and private entities such as JPS, Digicel, Flow, it can improve infrastructure. It enhance the cybersecurity and support renewable energy efforts. This partnership can drive investment, as Mr. Forrest is always mentioning. It modernize key services, and it also strengthens the country's critical infrastructure. These partnerships, they offer opportunities for innovation, economic growth by leveraging private sector enterprises and resources. The government now can improve service delivery by boosting efficiency and also creating jobs, while private companies can gain access to new markets and long-term investments. So the public-private partnership, it can also foster great resilience against cyber threats and ensuring that Jamaica's infrastructure remains robust and adaptable to future challenges. With the right framework and policies in place, these partnerships can significantly enhance national development and security.
Yes, and to build off what my colleague said, you know, the policies, the procedures, they need all of those. And another more a more practical way of showing these organizations the importance of having all of these having all of the policies in mind. Or for instance, like drills, you know, like in school you have the fire drill, you have the earthquake drills. You can do the same thing for cybersecurity with a simulated cyber attack. So you have a specific day in a month where the whichever organization wants to take it on, it and simulate, say, a company gets hit with a ransomware, and you have that for all of the different entities, and how they would you can see how they would react in that situation. So what their response would be like, their modus operandi, their instance, their reactivity, then, and see if in an event like that, they're the same policies that would want to serve or guide them in, or how they would be enacted or followed in a real life situation. So help them to refine their strategies and improve their coordination with both us as the law enforcement, with other entities as well in the private and public sector.
Trevor, you're making a liar out of me this evening, you know, because I had said that was my final question, but the fact that you brought the MSMEs and smaller businesses as well as publicly listed companies into the fray, I have one final question before I ask you for your final thoughts. And that is, to what extent do you think practitioners in the cyber ecosystem actually act as an obstacle to public-private partnerships because of the view that what is at stake is only available or only enough for a smaller number of practitioners within the ecosystem, rather than we can all work together as practitioners to bring the public and private sector together in a holistic, cohesive, and resilient cyber ecosystem for this country?
I think you're asking the wrong person that question, because while I know where you're coming from with that, I don't have a concept of that mindset. So I'm really not sure what I mean, honestly, I don't.
So Trevor, let me start to break it down to the brass tacks. why is it that the practicing cybersecurity service providers in Jamaica, barring a few, are so reluctant to share with law enforcement or the national setup when there is a breach, a discovery of a vulnerability, or challenges?
Okay. So I could only imagine one instance where you would have that kind of response. And that has to do with the fact that in some cases, some of the providers of that kind of service find themselves bound by non-disclosure agreements with their clientele. So much so that sharing information that is related to situations and scenarios that they see, which most times they're seeing with their clients, they cannot share that information. Now, again, if there is legislation that gave them sufficient cover so that they would be required to do that, then the resistance may wither away. But that's the only case that I would imagine that kind of reluctance would exist, because like I said, I don't, nothing in my organization functions that way. We are clear that in order to treat with this kind of threat, you can't, not share or work collectively. No one organization or individual or whatever can by themselves solve the ills that are rampant in this landscape. Can't happen. If you think you do, well, you're not going to last too long in this space, right? But I would imagine that if a provider is bound by some sort of non-disclosure agreement and so on, and they are trying to themselves protect the reputation of their entity with their clients, then they would have that kind of resistance. That's the only thing I could attribute that to.
Well, I thank you for that frank response, but we really see something different when we look at the ecosystem and we look at what's out there. Your final thoughts.
Talking about but I'm just saying I can't relate.
Yeah, but I hear you, but the reality is say something different. Your final thoughts, ladies and gentlemen, as we bring this one to a wrap. Wendy, we'll start with you.
I gave you my final thoughts.
Let Trevor come in after the two of you. Wendy, Dave, then Trevor, and we wrap it.
All right. So today's discussion, it highlighted the essential role of public-private partnership in securing our critical infrastructure against evolving threats such as cyber attacks, right? So transparency, trust, and collaboration between government, businesses, and the public are vital for ensuring the resilience and safety of our infrastructure. As we move forward, it is clear that no single entity can address these challenges alone. Shared responsibilities and continuous dialogue are crucial. So, by working together and implementing actionable strategies, we can better protect the systems that underpin our security, economic, and our daily lives. Thank you, everyone, for your contributions, and let's continue this important work.
Thank you, Wendy. Dave, you're up.
Yeah, good night, everyone. So, as my fellow panelists have already mentioned, there's an importance for the unified approach towards the critical infrastructure protection. Because it allows for comprehensive risk assessments, where the public and private intelligence can come together and lead to a more robust mitigation strategy, preparedness plans, the response plans as well, and also the government structure, the governance structure, sorry, must remain flexible and evolve, through continuous review, continuous restructuring of the plans as well, in order to adapt to the different changes in the cybersecurity landscape. You need to incorporate lessons from past events, the emerging technologies, and you need a strong arm in the government agencies and as well as the private entities. Clarification on the role, the responsibilities, the accountability. Because the accountability is a strong point for this one, in order to facilitate the smooth collaboration between both private and public sector. And in short, the discussion today was enlightening and really about a further need, or about the importance of this kind of partnership for the longevity of the nation as well as the citizens. So thank you all for your participation tonight.
Trevor, the final word is yours.
Well, no, I mean, I think I've said more than my fair share. I have given my closing remarks. I just want to thank the team for inviting me to participate. And I think that we just need to, again, make sure that we understand what needs to happen to encourage and motivate the two constituencies, that is public and private sector, to work together to actually make this thing happen, because it's a necessary thing. And whatever we need to do to get both parties cooperating, moving in the same direction and singing from the same sheet of music, we have to do. I will say that I think as practitioners, we need to start to seriously understand how we need to communicate to the target audience, which is the would-be partners, which is the private sector. I mean, I'm one of them, but I don't take much convincing. So I think we just need to kind of adjust the conversation so that we can make a more compelling case and motivate them to cooperate. So I thank you for inviting me, and I hope we can continue this conversation because it's, in my view, it's very important to foster, facilitate, and even demand public-private partnership for the protection of critical national infrastructure. Thank you.
There you have it, ladies and gentlemen. For us, the practitioners in cybersecurity, we normally talk in ones and zeros and security. But when we think about our national critical infrastructure and critical information infrastructure, the overwhelming sentiment is that we need to talk dollars and cents, so that maybe we can talk sense into some of the people that are there. Ladies and gentlemen, it's been a good evening, and certainly this has been one of the ways in which we're trying to go. Sometimes we can't get people during the day, so we try to get them in the evening. I thank you all for taking the time and sharing with us this evening. And that's a wrap. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.